I spoke here in 2011, although I was in a very different circumstance, although still a difficult one. I'd like to, I know there's an intense desire to ask questions of me, and it is actually really extremely boring, I think, to have a beamed-in guest. People are so mediated these days, they think it's really watching TV. But I want to assure you, I'm not on TV. You are just seeing me beamed in from an embassy. But the way to kind of break through that is to go pretty quickly to questions. In trying to think about this speech, actually, so much has happened since 2011. It's really hard to condense what has shifted in my world perspective. It's hard to condense what has shifted in my world perspective to a simple formula. There's also interesting contextual situation surrounding this talk itself, which I think we should speak about, but perhaps not at length, because although I quite like to get into the nitty-gritty of that debate, I think in some ways it does tend to diminish the seriousness of the rest of the matters I have to talk about. So I want to start by going to a book that was published by Cambridge University Press on Wilfrid Burchett. And Wilfrid Burchett was an Australian journalist, active since about 1935 to the late 70s. The Australian government cancelled his passport while he was out of Australia for a period of 17 years. And they tried to do this to me as well. And so I feel a certain parallel exists between me and Burchett. The time is different, but we can see in the censorship and approach to Burchett attributes of the form that Western censorship takes, which although is now in a kind of interesting, hyper-modern, hyper-fluid state as a result of the internet, nonetheless retains some features from Burchett. Well, Burchett was born in Gippsland, which is a small town not far from Melbourne. He was working class, very bright, learnt languages on the farm, and eventually, like many Australians, longed to get out of the what was then a very provincial Australian atmosphere. Examples of that are John Pilger, Germaine Greer, Clive James, a number of others, maybe even Dame Everidge, a number of others that will be known to you here in Cambridge. Also the journalist who broke the Cambridge spy ring was an Australian. And I'll often ask myself, why is it that Australians are disproportionately represented amongst provocateurs or provocative characters in London? And my conclusion is, I think, says something bad about London, namely that there is an example of someone who is non-white, that's Tariq Ali, doing a similar thing. Tariq Ali came from a very privileged background in Pakistan, very wealthy background, and eventually became president of the Oxford Union. But if we look of people outside of the English and Scottish within the British Isles, it is mostly Australians taking these roles. So that the discrimination against people from the colonies who were dark-skinned, of course, was much higher. So he'll have to both be brilliant and rich in the case of Tariq Ali to break through. The discrimination against whites from the colonies, while still there, was not as severe, and so did allow Australians to come to London and to break through. But why didn't people within London, why didn't the English break through in the same way? Well, it's because the extensive networks and class structures and some parts of the culture that exists here in London did not allow the English, properly speaking, to make those steps. Now, when trying to explain to American colleagues the problems that exist in London society, I try to explain it like this. Imagine if New York, Washington, LA, San Francisco, and Chicago were all in DC for the past 400 years, and the US was an empire for 400 years. Can you imagine what the culture would be like? What would the clubs be like? What would be the inheritance structures? What would be the ability for people to fluidly move around their class structures? Very limited. So I really think it is that demographic aspect of England, where more than 80% of corporate registrations are in London, and the top schools are close to London in one way or another, that has led to a concentration of establishment networks in London, which has led to, in many ways, a quite constraining and stultifying atmosphere. For Burchett, his first big, he made many stories about Nazi Germany and was involved in helping get Jews out of Nazi Germany, but he has the Burchett broke what is the 20th century's, arguably the 20th century's most important story. And there was intense reaction by the United States and others to that story, and an attempt to suppress it, which of course has subsequently proved to be, he subsequently proved to be right. So to give you, I want to read a bit about Burchett's first story. This is the story that led to the West as a whole moving to clamp down on him. Burchett was the first person, the first Western journalist in Hiroshima. The dead counted number 53,000, and another 30,000 are missing, which means certainly dead. In the days I have stayed in Hiroshima, and this is nearly a month after the bombing, 100 people have died subsequently. There were some 13,000 seriously injured by the explosion, and they have been dying at the rate of 100 a day. And they'll probably all die. Another 40,000 were slightly injured. These casualties might not have been as high, except for a tragic mistake. The authorities thought this was another routine super fort raid. That was a type of plane involved in the fire bombings of Tokyo. The plane flew over the target and dropped a parachute which carried a bomb to its explosion point. The American plane passed out of sight. The all clear was sounded, and the people of Hiroshima came out of their shelters. Almost a minute later, the bomb reached an altitude of 2,000 feet, at which point it was time to explode, at the moment when nearly everybody in Hiroshima was back on the streets. Hundreds upon hundreds of the dead were so badly burned in the terrific heat generated by the bomb, it was not even possible to tell whether they were men or women, old or young. Of thousands of others near the center of the explosion, there was no trace. They vanished. The theory in Hiroshima is that the atomic heat was so great they burned instantly to ashes, except that there were no ashes. If you could see what is left of Hiroshima, you would think that London had not been touched by bombs. In the hospitals, I found people who, when the bomb fell, suffered absolutely no injuries, but are now dying from the uncanny after effects. For no apparent reason, their health began to fail. They lost appetite, their hair fell out, bluish spots appeared on their bodies, and the bleeding began from ears, nose, and mouth. At first, the doctors told me they thought these were symptoms of general debility. They gave the patients vitamin A injections. The results were horrible. The flesh started rotting away from the hole caused by the injection of the needle, and in every case, the victim died. This is one of the after effects of the first atomic bomb man has ever dropped, and I do not want to see any more examples of it. But in the walking through the rubble in the months after, I found many others. So all that writing of Burchett has subsequently proven to be true. There are intense radiation effects after the dropping of an atomic bomb. The reaction to Burchett in the press of the United States was to vilify him and to ignore him. But he was such a prolific character and writer that instead he used that vilification to use that vilification to see a comparative advantage. And it's a comparative advantage that I've often seen in our work, which is that once you are on the end of quite substantial attacks from, well, in our case, the Pentagon, State Department, National Security Agency, and so on, and their allies in other countries and in the mainstream media, you cease to become concerned with making sure your shirt is absolutely spotless, because people are throwing mud at you every day. And this gives you a sort of freedom of movement, because you're not so concerned about whether you should be perfectly politically correct or whether some press attack by someone will lose you support or gain you support. You must have established yourself both as a person and in terms of your organization, in terms of how you're earning your living, in a way which is immune to this kind of criticism. So Burchett then started reporting from behind the North Korean lines in the Korean War, from behind the lines in Vietnam and a number of other countries, and use that as a comparative advantage. Okay, so a lot of what has happened to WikiLeaks is a bit like that. If I can, I know we want to go to questions quickly, but if I can sum up what I think is my perspective on what is happening with the press in the West and how it structures to dissuade people from talking about certain things or publishing certain things it is essentially along the lines of Chomsky's and Herman's propaganda model. And that's probably well known to some of you, but I want to restate it and then try and see how the invention of the internet has changed that model in some important respects, but not in other respects. So Chomsky and Herman's model is essentially, and Herman is actually another Australian who was an expert in institutional structures. It is that if we let's look at who owns the press and who works in the press and who its customers are. Now, the customers of the commercial press are advertisers. The product is audience attention, which is sold to advertisers. The owners are either people in other large industries or who have interest in other large industries, or they are press barons, so they're a very wealthy, connected class. Those people who work in the mainstream media in its management positions, those positions have the most influence, are similarly, if you look at their sort of class histories, but perhaps more importantly, what their social trajectories are quite well coupled to those major players in society as well. And even if they don't start out that way, soon enough, by being of interest to major players, they're invited into the social group of major players. So what would we expect from a press like that? Well, we would expect a press that favors the interests of those people who own it and those people who run it. In the BBC, in the case of the UK, we have another interesting factor, which is the BBC, which is very influential in terms of the news here. It has more than 60% of the what they call in the print industry the news hole. So it it produces 60% of the material that people read or watch about the news. And the BBC is, while it's not a commercial structure, its board of governors is formally appointed by the Queen. You can look at who those people are connected to, and it has for many years been closely involved with the UK intelligence services in one way or another. Up until the 80s, 40% of positions in the BBC were vetted by MI5. It's been also running something called the FBIS, the Foreign Broadcasting Information Service, in collaboration with the CIA, the Central Intelligence Service. So BBC and the CIA divvied up the world to collect information from other broadcasters, radio stations and newspapers, create digests and feed that back to the United States and the United Kingdom, to Cabinet, and then exchange that information. So what would we expect the general interests of the BBC to be like? We'd expect that they would try and preserve the interests of the people who run the BBC and the people who ultimately control appointments at the BBC, and that's pretty much what we see. What's changed about that is that the internet means that publishing is more accessible than ever before and has been internationalized. That has led to essentially the hoi polloi being able to publish, being able to have a word. And that's led to many great things. It has led to the greatest period of political education that has ever occurred. There is no period in history where the lateral spread of information across the world, from people who know something to people who want to know something, has been as great. There's perhaps been individual moments, so the French Revolution, parts of the Enlightenment, maybe in relation to some conflicts that have occurred, where within a particular country we've seen more progress. But if you're talking about the population of the world, there has never been a generation which has been so quickly educated as a result of this. But establishments are not just sitting by. Previously, it was mostly those people who had some connection to power who could speak. When I spoke about those mainstream press institutions, but even if you look at, say, book publishers, you needed a sponsor to get what you wanted to say into the broader culture. That's no longer true. And what that has meant is an incredible drive towards censorship, because the censorship by exclusion from access that used to exist has been tremendously marginalized and undercut by people being able to tweet whatever they like or run their own websites for a relatively small fee. So if you think about society's, the direction a society takes is the direction that its major factions push for its culture and its economy. Previously, a lot of the cultural aspects were suppressed because they could only be communicated from word to word. Now they can come out and be communicated more easily, which means that the irritating underclass of society and even the irritating middle class is able to speak in such a way which offends the more powerful interests in society. So you see a push towards various kinds of censorship and to try and create different classes of people who can speak and who can publish. In other words, the seemingly previous push towards universalism and universal rights in relation to freedom of speech have fallen away, because it never really was a push towards universalism. It was a push towards powerful press interests having a right to speak, to parliamentarians having a right to speak, and to those who had access to the press having a right to speak, but not everyone having a right to speak. So let's see how that is panning out in practice. Well, other than a variety of laws and reinterpretation of law on the rights of people to speak, we are seeing new private arenas of law, such as Facebook. Facebook has Facebook is, if you like, a society where people communicate, a very important society, because so much communication occurs between people in that society. And now it's being festooned with laws. And these are not laws that are passed by a parliament. These are laws that are introduced by the Facebook dictatorship, by a company which has no balancing mechanisms within it to try and shape and manage the society that it envelops for its own interests. Some of those interests have to do with wanting to get as many people onto Facebook. Others have to do with who it finds to be a competitor, the interests of its staff, who can get at its staff, who can get at its owners, the jurisdictions in which Facebook has assets, how it has to manage those assets and fend off attacks, whether they're from the United States government or from Turkey or from the United Kingdom. So this new golden age of freedom of expression is now being wound back. It's being wound back because of its success in allowing so many people to speak. That has generated within itself pressure to put freedom of speech back in the bottle and stop it causing so much irritation to the groups that control in one way or another the infrastructure on which we communicate. Okay. Now I think we should go to questions. Yeah, let's go to questions straight away. I do have quite a lot of other material to get through, so I'm happy to be here for quite a while. Yeah?
To open up the floor to questions, we've got one, first of all, from online, just to start things off. Dylan asks, would you have released the leaks that you released if you had known that it would directly put people's lives at risk?
Great question, completely false premise, very interesting about what it says about the media. The US government has had to admit under oath that not a single person that they could find had been harmed physically by any of the material that we have published. Now, have politicians had to resign as a result of what we have published? Yes, the answer is yes. Have intelligence ministers had to resign? Yes. Have defense chiefs had to resign? Yes. Have elections changed their result? Probably, in the case of Peru, probably in the case of Kenya. Have democratic revolutions occurred and dictators been overthrown, partly as a result of what we released in the case of Tunisia? The answer, according to Tunisian academics, is yes.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor? Just there. Do you want to? Microphone's not working over there. We'll come to you next. Sorry. Oh, go on.
Just building on that, I worked in the film industry, and I know a lot of my colleagues at Sony were quite embarrassed, in the very least, by the hacking that happened last year. How do you respond to releasing thousands and thousands of those emails that contained health records and social security numbers?
Well, we're very proud of publishing that material by Sony. Now, it had already been published by the hackers concerned, whoever they are. But interesting phenomenon, although it was available as a torrent, it couldn't be useful to journalism. It couldn't be useful to help understand our society. And so we indexed it, we threw it into our search engine. To give you an understanding about WikiLeaks as a whole, so WikiLeaks was founded in 2007 by me, and we now have published more than 10 million documents, and we have a number of sophisticated investigative search engines to understand that primary source record. Let me tell you a bit about Sony. And this is something that, in my experience, holds true for every major corporation. Sony was discovered to be deeply involved in politics, in a very nasty way. For example, Sony tried to manipulate the Scottish referendum and David Cameron. we published an email showing the brief for the CEO of Sony for him going into the meeting with David Cameron last year. Now, what was on the agenda for that meeting? Well, there was a number of matters. One was that Sony wanted extra discounts from the UK in relation to film investment, tax discounts. They was also concerned about copyright law in the UK, wanted it to suit Sony more. So that's what Sony wanted. What did Sony have? What did Sony have? It had two things. One, it had investment money. You could spend a bit more money investing in the UK in terms of film production. But actually, most of these film productions, the tax office doesn't make a dime because of the tax concessions. But the other thing that it had was the broadcasting date of Outlander. Now, Outlander is a series produced by Sony set in Scotland in the 1700s, where the redcoats are going in and causing problems in Scotland. In fact, the first episode has a scene where the primary character, the female protagonist, is raped by an English redcoat. And this was going to be broadcast in the run-up to the Scottish referendum. And the CEO went in, met with David Cameron, and a deal was done. And it was not broadcast in the United Kingdom until after the referendum. But in other countries, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, it was. Here, it didn't even get to be broadcast on TV. They sold it to Amazon Prime, so didn't even get to be broadcast in a popular network within the United Kingdom. Similarly, Sony was involved in trying to cover up the fact that Sony cameras were found in the guided missiles that fell on Gaza. There's a discussion about how to play the press in this regard. A number of similar conspiracies, if you will, in relation to trying to back up Israel one way or another, because a lot of people in Sony are connected, they feel, to the fate of Israel.
Another question from the floor. Yes, just down there.
I was just wondering what your views were on the Australian government seeking to bypass the courts and give itself the authority to cancel the passports of Australians suspected to be involved in terrorist activity, and also if you think the direction of the government will change under Malcolm Turnbull.
Australia is a great country in many respects, but it is sad how it's become essentially a Pacific theatre aircraft carrier for the United States. A couple of years ago, a Marines base was opened in the Northern Territory in Australia. The first US military base, non-spy base, containing armed soldiers since World War II in Australia. So that's a sad thing to see, but it's been like that since at least 1975, where there was a Labor government, a new Labor government in the 70s. The war in Vietnam was on the nose. There was also a youth demographic, so you had a introduction of free education. Many of these things that we've seen in the West in the 70s also happened in Australia. And the government of Gough Whitlam started investigating the spy bases in Australia. And the Attorney General even went to ASIO, which is the Australian equivalent MI5, in a sort of raid of its files. And that morning, the archives of part of the archives of ASIO suddenly caught fire and burnt down. And there's a number of concerns, some of those expressed in our cables, others you can see with in a film called The Falcon and the Snowman, which is about the conviction of an American who was feeding stuff from Australia to the CIA, to the Russians, about how there was a push from very conservative elements in Australia that had been working with the United States intelligence agencies and the British royal family, and found a constitutional trick involving the Governor-General, who had reserve powers, which at that point were not well known in Australia. But essentially the Prime Minister can fire the Governor-General can fire the Prime Minister and appoint a new Prime Minister without resorting to an election. So that is what happened, and that whole government was thrown out. Since that time, the Labor Party has learnt its lesson, and it will not touch the US alliance at all. It has been much like the Blairites in the United Kingdom. And the Conservatives, while they're not they don't as slavishly, all elements as slavishly adhere to the US and not quite as sycophantic, nonetheless see their interests aligned in that way.
Do we have another question from the floor? Yes, over there.
Yes, good evening, Julian. I just had a very simple and quick question. Why did you choose this specific background as picture that you have behind you? Thank you.
I'm glad you asked that question. And I think members of this union are going to both love and hate the answer. Okay, this background is from a documentary film that we produced in 2010 based on a leaked US military, based on the gun camera footage of a Apache helicopter which mowed down 18 people in New Baghdad in 2007, including 2 Reuters journalists. Allegedly leaked by Chelsea Manning, my alleged co-conspirator, who has been sentenced to 35 years in a US military prison under the Espionage Act, purely for working with the press. There's no other allegation. Now, I had this as my background, a moving version of it, when I spoke to the Oxford Union in 2013, with very, very interesting results. First of all, the Oxford Union, on finding out that I was going to have this as the background, cut off the live feed. So it could not be broadcast live to the world, my talk. Secondly, astoundingly, once it was, the video was edited to put on YouTube, they spent an enormous amount of time, and I assume money, in editing out the background. They edited the whole background out, and then even in the audience footage, where there was they had some TV screens in the audience, so people were not so close to the screen could just look at the TV that was close to them. So in the video camera footage of the audience of the Oxford Union, they edited out the background in the footage of the TV screens and the audience looking at them. Why did they do that? Because this footage, at one moment, was classified by the US. It's just astounding that the Oxford Union would try and do that. And then when we started debating with them, saying, you guys are complete idiots, they said that they had legal advice and so on. And then they got to the point of saying, well, it's not because we're afraid of the US military, it's not because Richard Dearlove, the former intelligence chief, is closely connected to the Oxford Union, it's because it's copyrighted. That the US government, it's the US government took this footage, and therefore the copyright is to the US government. But actually the US government does not assert copyright in relation to material that is produced incidentally in the course of its work. So I would like to play this video, because I want to see, when the tape of this is done, what's really going on with Cambridge. Can Cambridge beat Oxford in this respect, or are they going to spend a week editing this out? Okay.
Yep, sure. Why not?
Okay, that's the part one. Then it jumps forward to this background. Let me lay it out a bit. So that's New Baghdad, 2007, a group of men hanging around on the corner. Apache comes around and wipes them out. They're not fighting with the US, but why we called the documentary Collateral Murder was the next scene. So in the scene you saw before, one of the Reuters journalists was killed. In fact, the principal visual figure who runs across a trash heap to escape the fire and is blown up. That's one of the Reuters journalists. The other one, Saeed Shma, crawls away, and he's the only person left alive. He's grievously wounded, and Good Samaritans just happen to be driving by and stop to see what's happening with him and take him to hospital. The car has 2 young children in it.
Okay. Bushmaster Crazy Horse, we have individuals going to the scene, possibly picking up bodies and weapons. Come on, let's shoot. Bushmaster Crazy Horse 1-8. Roger, we have a black SUV or a Pongo truck picking up the bodies. Request permission to engage. Bushmaster 7, Roger. Bushmaster 7, Roger, engage. 1-8, clear. Come on. Clear. Clear. Working. Oh yeah, look at that, right through the windshield.
Okay, so let's see what the Cambridge Union does with that.
I mean, a phone call to the lawyers, maybe. But, next question. Yes, just down here.
Hi. In terms of helping us to understand the world better, what do you think some of the most important documents released by WikiLeaks or series of documents have been? Thank you.
That's a good question. I like that you said series of documents, because generally speaking, the world's a complex place. It's, big institutions interacting together. Fascinating how the world actually works. But to really understand it, you have to distill all that interaction. It's generally speaking not within a document. A document can be an example of something or example of a tendency, but to see whether it is a tendency, you need to read a lot of stuff. It's one of the reasons that I made this book, which just published recently, which has been the #1 bestseller at Foyles in London. And it's attempted to distill some of our cable documents. We've now published 2.7 million US diplomatic cables, even 500,000 this year, and produced something called the Public Library of US Diplomacy, which is a big search engine, so you can actually kind of have this be fairly useful. I think as a collection, that's probably the most significant collection of material we have produced. But I'm really happy with this kind of meta search engine that we have now, where we have the most detailed records of the 2 most modern wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, nearly 1 million records from those, 2.7 million diplomatic cables. We also mined out most of the military-industrial sector on LinkedIn. Quite interesting what people will put in there. Many keywords, many people admitting that they've been involved in assassinations programs and so on. icwatch.wikileaks.org. All of this can be searched at once. If you want to kind of get a view on that, search for JPEL. That's Joint Priority Effects List. That is the combined US-NATO assassination list that has been operating in Afghanistan. It's not just the US who votes on the targets now, by the way. Sweden, and Germany are the other two countries that vote on who is to be assassinated. Without any judicial oversight, there's no way to get yourself off the list. If you find out you're on the list, you're not told you're on the list, and so on. But you'll see the kind of the scale and scope of our materials, because JPEL is mentioned in cables that we've published, in the Iraq and Afghan war logs, in IC Watch, in the Stratfor files with several million of those. So it gives you a kind of a good feel. Now, if we want to go to individual examples, I have two. One's about this country. Actually, it doesn't tell you so much, but it's sort of cute because it names Cameron Haig and George Osborne directly. And this is Cameron, sorry, this is Haig going into the US Embassy in 2010 and speaking to the US ambassador to try and get support for the Conservatives to win the election, presumably. And it's interesting, what support could the United States give for the Conservatives to win the election here? Very interesting to try and imagine how could the US assist or not assist someone in the UK winning an election or not. So Haig goes in, and this is what the US ambassador writes back to Washington. Haig said he, David Cameron, and George Osborne were, quote, children of Thatcher, unquote, and staunch Atlanticists. For his part, said Haig, he is a sister who is American, spends his vacations in America, and like many others similar to him, considers America, quote, the other country to turn to. Asking his senior advisor her views, she said, America is the essential country. Haig said, whoever enters 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister soon learns of the essential nature of the relationship with the United States. He added, quote, we want a pro-American regime. We need it. The world needs it. I think in that, it's really the word regime that does it for me. Haig declaring we need a pro-American regime. I'm not sure, is he talking about the British government? Is he talking about the entire world? But Haig is, I mean, it is embarrassing. Haig is, he's a bright guy. He thinks, presumably, that he's glad handling the US ambassador, that he's, sucking up, licking up, or whatever, to gain support from the United States for the Conservatives in the election. But either we must say that Haig believes, number one, that US support in the 2010 election was important, and number two, that you need to genuflect in this manner to the US ambassador in order to get that support. Or number two, that Haig genuinely believes that, and that is the correct way to carry on. And I think either of these two prospects is, well, I wouldn't say frightening. I think it's just indicative of the way the relationship is between the UK and the United States. If we can put it in economic terms, there's $4 trillion of US investment in the UK, $2 trillion of UK investment in the United States. The other table, which I think is most indicative of how the world works, has suddenly become unexpectedly important and poignant. And that's a cable about the largest Kurdish TV station, ROJ TV. This is part of the cable here. So ROJ was based in Denmark, and it's too hard for it to exist in Turkey because of the crackdown against the Kurds by the Turks. So it beamed up from Denmark to Eurosat and beamed down to Kurdistan, to the Kurds in Turkey, northern Syria, and in Iraq. Those Kurds in northern Syria and Iraq, and Kobani and Iraqi towns, of course, have become famous now because of ISIS. Barack Obama, Turkey, the Prime Minister of Denmark, the Danish intelligence services, and the Danish prosecution service together engaged in a conspiracy to destroy ROJ-TV, completely destroy, so that Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, could get a plum job being the head of NATO. And until just recently, he was the head of NATO. He's that guy making all those intemperate statements, inflammatory statements about Russia and so on. That's Rasmussen. Now, the detail of the cable is this. The head legal advisor of PET, it's a Danish intelligence agency, goes in with one of the chief prosecutors of the prosecution authority, who are meant to be independent and objective in Denmark, equivalent to the CPS here, but legally they're meant to be more objective. They go in together to the US Embassy and say, well, the problem with ROJ-TV, we know the Turks demand that we get rid of that thing if Rasmussen is to become the head of NATO. And we know you guys, the Americans, are happy with that. The problem is, it's already been twice to the Broadcasting Commission here in Denmark, and they've found that there's no connection with ROJ-TV and the PKK, so we can't get them on a terrorism angle. And also in terms of the content, it's not promoting terrorism, and it's also not, it's reporting violence just like any other news station. It's been cleared twice. So that's our basic problem. But we think we can go after them on tax. We're going to look at all their finances, go after some tax, and the US ambassador advises them to look extra creatively in relation to that. And they think maybe they can go after them in content, but maybe the content is a bit too Kurdish and not Turkish enough. It's not really objective enough, the content. This Kurdish language broadcaster broadcasting to Kurdistan is too Kurdish. So that's what happened. It was knocked off based on it being too Kurdish. They got rid of the license. Rasmussen became the head of ROJ-TV. Elsewhere in another cable, it says that that it was a POTUS brokered deal, President of the United States brokered deal. So what does that show to you? Well, it's one of the most flagrant cases of censorship, knocking off an entire TV station, knocking off, to a degree, an entire language group of an oppressed people for not just exigent circumstances of, say censorship in relation to ISIS might be an exigent circumstance, but so bloody Rasmussen could get a plum job at NATO without the Turks causing problems. Now this is in the country that Europe likes to sell as being, a leading example of liberal democracy. I'm telling you, Denmark, Sweden, to agree Norway, are leading examples of liberal democracy because no one knows anything about those countries. No one cares about those countries. No one looks into the interior of those countries. No one even speaks their languages. And they are very careful to manage a perception of what they do and who they are. But under the surface, you see, when there's big powers afoot, the rights of a TV station or a people or a language are just pushed aside.
We have another question that's been sent in. Mr. Assange, did you rape those women who allegedly raped them? And given your position on freedom of speech, does it upset you at all that your voice will always be heard louder than theirs will?
Well, I'm surprised that the questioner didn't start by giving me a trigger warning in relation to those types of questions. Okay, first of all, no woman has alleged rape against me. No woman. Yeah? So why is anyone suggesting otherwise? Well, you're suggesting otherwise because, well, I don't want to cast aspersions on the motivations of the question, but generally speaking, because of false reportage. So the situation that exists right now, for me legally, is there's an enormous espionage case in the United States pending prosecution, which the United States says in Cable Traffic to Australia is of unprecedented size and scale. The 5 charge types, we don't know how many of each charge, but we know the charge types. Espionage, conspiracy to commit espionage, Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is, the section of that is a terrorism offence. Section 1A, which is a mini espionage act that is included within the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. General conspiracy and conversion. That's 45 years, not including any multiplications of those charges. That case started before any of this talk about Sweden. And there's a number of other cases. We have a case in, I have a case in Saudi Arabia in relation to publishing of Saudi cables. I have another case in Australia where we revealed last year the largest Australian, a suppression order on the largest Australian corruption case, which involved kickbacks for Australian banknotes throughout Southeast Asia. So that is the context. Now, where are things formally in this Swedish preliminary investigation? That's what they call it. Formally, I have already been cleared by the Chief Prosecutor of Stockholm, made a decision. No crime has been committed, and the case itself was dropped and closed. Now, it was resurrected. In the middle of our publications about Iraq and Afghanistan by a Swedish politician, Claes Borgström, now a disgraced figure because of his corrupt involvement in another case, the corrupt involvement in a case about someone who was falsely convicted for 8 murders across 6 separate trials. The woman herself says the police made it up and that she was railroaded, that she had no intention on making a complaint. That's where we are legally. So I find it kind of very interesting that no one wants to listen to the facts and no one wants to listen to the women. It is the state of Sweden that has made these accusations. It's the state that is pursuing the case, and it doesn't have a finding. I haven't been charged. I've previously been cleared. The woman concerned says the police made it up and that she was railroaded.
We've got time for 2 very quick questions. I'm going to take one online first and then one from in the room. Somebody online says, how do you reconcile the fact that you are in the Ecuadorian embassy considering Ecuador's record on human rights and free speech?
Well, this is a question Edward Snowden often gets as well. Well, this is a serious situation. Refugees are, if they're bona fide refugees, are in serious situations. It's not like they can, go to an unlimited number of countries. So the most important thing is that the country has the political independence to use their asylum law. Now, I ran Edward Snowden, well, I still run Edward Snowden's defense campaign from this embassy. Me, other staff in WikiLeaks, Sarah Harrison being one, got him out of Hong Kong. We had a head-to-head contest with the US government in 2013. A well-defined contest. We wanted to get Edward Snowden asylum. The US government wanted to put him in prison, ultimately to the United States, or in the medium term in a prison in Hong Kong during extradition process. They lost in that process. But part of that process was taking what I knew about asylum and the press and diplomatic connections and computer security to conduct the operation safely and get him asylum by filing asylum applications. So we filed nearly 30 asylum applications 21 in the first round, to nearly every country, including nearly every country in Western Europe. Not the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom already put out a preemptive travel ban on all UK carriers, administratively, just like that, no court process, banned him from flying any aeroplane that was registered in the United Kingdom. But all those Western European countries rejected him in that case. Similarly, I filed many asylum applications, and a number of countries were taking their time. Ecuador was the first country that was a democracy to step forward and offer asylum. And Ecuador is an interesting country. It's a brave country. It's 14 million people. A very interesting government the last 8 years. Like all countries, especially developing countries, it has its share of problems, but it is also doing a lot of interesting work. But it's, you know, I'm not a spokesperson for the government of Ecuador. I'm a political refugee in this situation. And political refugees need a state that will formally protect them.
One from the floor. Yes, just over there. The girl in the red top.
Hi, I'm just wondering what you think your future looks like now. What's going to be the best case scenario? What's going to be the worst case scenario? And what's going to have to happen in the world or in the US government to get you out of the Ecuadorian embassy?
Looking at this from, well, you know, it's a political situation, so it's all just a matter of politics, so it's all a matter of public support. It's obviously one of the reasons I'm speaking to you guys here. I find it enjoyable to teach people things, but also I'm here because it is a political situation and we need political support. That political support has been coalescing though. Now within continental Europe, it's quite strong. Support for German state TV had a broadcast an ad for WikiLeaks, for people to send WikiLeaks documents. We're pretty mainstream in Germany, not to the degree that the deep state fully supports us, of course, because of their relationship with the US. They need to be diplomatic. In France, significant support. That's also true for Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning. There's been a statue of the three of us erected in Alexanderplatz. It then went to Geneva, to front of the United Nations, and to Pompidou in Paris. And I understand it's going off to Strasbourg and then the European Parliament. So within the continent, actually, things are a lot clearer. In the United Kingdom, the UK, because of its relationship with the United States, because of its formal relationship with the UK extradition order, because GCHQ has been spying on us and me for a long time, came out in the Snowden documents, there's a different type of interaction. And perhaps because the tabloid press here are uniquely bad and uniquely obsessed by sex. The atmosphere is not as good. In the US, popular culture, actually the atmosphere is better than it is in the United Kingdom in some respects. Yes, there is a militaristic aspect to the United States. And yes, the US deep state has between 100,000 and about 5.5 million people. That's the number of people with security clearances in the United States. And that means that opposition is very intense. On the other hand, the US is a more diverse society than London is. The US does have multiple poles. The greatest number of corporate registrations are in New York. That has 17% of corporate registrations. London has 80% of corporate registrations. So there's different sectors in the United States in a way that there's not so much in the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, except for Scotland and Wales, is pretty much integrated into one quite revolting interplay between social groups. There's not the same freedom. There's not the same freedom for people to speak in the United Kingdom who have any power. In order to run an organization or get some power or get some funding, there's certain compromises that have to be made in the United Kingdom where there's more niches in the United States. So you can have a view, if you look at the UK press, that becomes quite skewed. On the other hand, when there is, people come here and they speak to taxi drivers. So the taxi driver consensus is very favorable to me and to WikiLeaks. It's interesting to look at this result of the Cambridge Union vote as well. Because yes, it is partly a vote about freedom of speech, but it is also partly, a vote about me. It's quite interesting to look at those more representative demographic indicators. We often have a mistake what society feels about something with what the press feels about something. And they're often fairly different. YouGov has been running a poll for the past, at least for the past 2 years, on me and 2,000 other people who are prominent in the public eye, politicians and TV personalities and so on, within the United Kingdom. And I was complaining to someone that the press here is just so bad as far as we're concerned, that it was hard to kind of get anywhere politically, but in the continent it's much better. And as sort of evidence of this, I went and looked up this YouGov poll. So at that time, I had an approval rating of -38 within the UK. And I thought, that's terrible, -38. I mean, how can we possibly get past that? There is obviously a positive and negative side to get to -38, but predominantly negative. Until I discovered that David Cameron is -42, and the Treasurer is -39. So actually, if you're in the public eye in some kind of debate, actually, it tends to be the case you get negative approval ratings.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for, I'm afraid. Thank you all very much for coming, and thank you all for getting your way through security. One thing to note...
If I can just speak about one thing, which
I
should reference, which is this vote itself, this referendum. Now, I've had some thoughts about that, but if we break it up into categories, well, perhaps I should just explain for the record that I was invited to speak, and then something happened, and then it was thrown to a referendum as to whether my invitation should be cancelled, and 77% of people voted that it shouldn't be cancelled and I should speak. Okay. The Cambridge Union has said that that's the first time in 200 years. So is that a bad precedent or a good precedent? I think that's a very important question. Now, you could look at it in a very negative sense about the climate that exists within Cambridge. So is it the case that the Cambridge Union, after inviting me to speak, because my guess is it presumed it could get an audience, which is correct, after inviting me to speak, did it start to feel pressure that it couldn't handle? And then in response to that pressure, felt it needed to get a democratic mandate to back it up. Okay. That means perhaps that the union has become more susceptible to pressure in relation to speakers. Or on the other hand, you could say perhaps the union has been bolder, the committee has been bolder and is inviting bolder speakers. And before, there was internal censorship at the committee level, and so it never got to the point where the committee felt it needed to be backed up by a democratic mandate. But I was invited and spoke in 2011, and there was no need then was felt to get a backup by the population. So that possibly the situation has deteriorated for the union since 2011. But if we look forwards, actually, I think it's maybe not a bad idea. Perhaps it is a good precedent, not a bad one. And a good precedent in this respect. Obviously, historically, the committee has engaged in self-censorship in terms of speakers. That's just a reality of all modern institutions. For example, I think it's quite questionable whether it would present someone from Hezbollah, Saeed Nasrallah, for example. Possibly quite questionable. A number of others, it's questionable whether now the committee would feel that it could do that. And almost certainly in the past it has censored those people. It has not invited them because of the social and perhaps political pressure that it feels. But if we can get into a routine of getting popular backing to oppose those sorts of pressures by throwing to referendum, then I think that is not a bad outcome. I think that will probably stiffen the spine of the union because it believes it can throw to referendum and show that there is strong support from the majority of people to hear controversial speakers, even if there is a small and often ignorant minority opposing it.
Cool, time for some free speech. To clear up the record, we sent an invite to Mr. Assange. We also sent an invite to 3,500 other people. 3,500 other people don't respond instantly. When Mr. Assange responded, we took a decision. That decision was made without any pressure from outside this building. That decision was made internally. We do not respond necessarily to pressure from outside this building. What we do is respond on the inside. We have a committee of 13 people that run this building. We decided as a group that this situation was unique, that unlike 2011, Mr. Assange is in an embassy. He's not in the United Kingdom. He does not obey the laws of the United Kingdom, of England and Wales. As a result, we asked the membership what we think, what they thought was best. That is the record.
All strictly nonsense, absolute nonsense. Of course, all human groups are susceptible to pressure. It is absolute nonsense. And then in relation to Mr. Assange being, I mean, come on. Your right to apply for asylum is a guaranteed right under the ICCPR and other UN conventions that the treaties and conventions that the UK is a party to, including the European Charter. So you always have a right to apply for asylum if you're then successful in gaining the asylum. That's always a right to pursue that legal option whenever you choose. Everyone has that right.
Yeah, no, that's cool. But at the same time, that's why people voted yes to the referendum, and some people disagreed and voted no in the referendum. But the facts remain clear. The situation was a unique one, and as a result, we asked the membership, and we stand by that decision, and I personally stand by that decision. But let's
I don't think it. I think it's a very interesting situation. I don't think, as far as invitations from the Cambridge Union is concerned, is unique, except in this respect. That there are factions within the UK who see me as a prestige threat. Various factions, and perhaps it is reasonably unique for me that I'm sort of wedged between two of these factions. The security establishment, which sees me as a prestige threat. The police now see me as a prestige threat. To a degree, some of the law courts see me as a prestige threat. The state sees me as a prestige threat in a very interesting way, which is the traditional formal definition of the state being the group, i.e. the establishment, that has a monopoly on the deployment of coercive force in a particular landmass, is perceptually undermined by my presence here, where conspicuously the state said, arrest that guy, and I'm not arrested. That does one of two things. It tells you either that the UK state, perceptually, not in reality, because there's treaties, but perceptually, is weak. It is not able to say, we're going to do this, and then do it. It's perceptually weak. Or alternatively, and much more interestingly, as those groups who claim to run the UK state, who claim to be in control of the UK state, which broadly speaking is the establishment by definition, do not actually control the UK state. Don't actually have the reins on that thing. Other things are involved, and other things are involved. International law is involved. The European Charter is involved. Even previous parliamentary law that is distasteful to some of those people is involved. So that's how I am a prestige threat to that section. Now, there is another section that has been sort of heavily abused by the tabloid press in this country, which has made me not about a national security case, not about freedom of press, but about this ridiculous sex case. So they have tried to whip that up, and that has then, if you like, eroded support from the social left. And so you then have these two coming together, and of course I see that in various work that we do within the United Kingdom. But that also comes together to pressure the Cambridge Union and its committee. That's the reality.
Let's not. All I will say is it's very lucky that those pressures didn't apply here at the time. And with that, I will ask you to join me in thanking...
No. I agree. Set the precedent. Set the precedent. It's impossible to pressure this committee, and it will produce greater freedom of speech if you set the example that you're impossible to pressure.